Imagine a quiet corridor, where every wall is made of mirrors framed by old memories. You walk slowly. In each mirror, a version of you appears. The one who smiled to avoid conflict. The one who agreed to be accepted. The one who stayed silent out of fear of being too ch. Versions that, over time, learn to not choose themselves, just to fit into spaces that never truly welcome their whole being. And then, you stop. In front of the next reflection, something shifts. For the first time, you hesitate. The automatic impulse to bend yourself to others' expectations is interrupted by a new kind of silence, the silence of awareness. In that almost invisible moment, a radical act is born. You choose yourself. It's subtle on the outside, but seismic within. According to Carl Jung, this is the turning point, when we begin to break away from the persona, the social mask we've worn to survive. This is where the journey of individuation begins, a direct confrontation with the archetypes of guilt, rejection, and self-abandonment. To choose yourself is not selfishness, it's honesty. It's the beginning of a new psychic order, where your energy no longer leaks into pleasing others but begins to align with who you truly are. In this video, you'll understand why this quiet moment, the day you finally choose yourself, can change everything. We'll explore the hidden cost of abandoning yourself, the inner shift that marks your awakening, and the silent power of radical self-loyalty. This journey requires courage, but it's the only one that leads you back to your truth. We don't abandon ourselves all at once. It happens in fragments, a series of quiet, invisible moments. Moments that seem harmless at first. The first time you were told to stop crying because strong people don't cry. The time you laughed when someone hurt you, just to prove you weren't too sensitive. The moment you realized that being silent made you more likable and less risky. These are not dramatic betrayals. They are small, almost imperceptible. But they add up, and what they erode is the inner compass, the felt sense of who you are when no one is watching. You begin to confuse performance with love, compliance with connection, and slowly, a false self emerges, one that is praised, rewarded, accepted, but hollow. This is the silent betrayal, not a betrayal of others, but of your inner truth. And because it's quiet, it hides behind what looks like being good. The good daughter, the good partner, the good friend, the good employee. Each roll a layer over the real you, protecting it, but also burying it. As Carl Jung wrote, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But long before we can reclaim that privilege, many of us learn how to hide. Why? Because attachment is survival. As children, we don't have the luxury of choosing authenticity over belonging. We choose love every time, even if it means abandoning ourselves in the process. We learn to read the emotional weather of the room. We shrink when someone else's anger grows. We shape-shift, not to manipulate, but to survive. This is where the persona begins. It is, in Jungian psychology, the social mask we wear to navigate the outer world. It helps us function, relate, adapt. But when the persona becomes the only version of us allowed to exist, it stops serving us and begins to replace us. The soul starts to feel the weight of this dissonance, not through words, but through symptoms: anxiety, numbness, chronic exhaustion, resentment that simmers beneath politeness, days that come without warning, or never come at all. You might find yourself overcommitting, constantly apologizing, or feeling invisible in conversations. You might say yes when every cell in your body screams no. And the world will admire you for it. They'll call you generous, empathetic, easygoing. But deep inside, something feels off. Like you're watching your life from behind a glass wall, present, but disconnected, alive, but unchosen. And here's the paradox that keeps so many people trapped. The more you betray yourself, the more praise you receive. For being strong. For never being too much. But strength without boundaries is not resilience. It's erosion. Being low maintenance may keep others comfortable, but it slowly empties you of color, voice, and essence. Jung believed that healing begins when we turn inward, not to judge what we became, but to understand why. Because there is no shame in adaptation. The problem is staying there forever. Staying in the mask until we forget who we were before it. The first act of inner healing is noticing. Noticing when your body contracts in a yes that should have been a no. Noticing when your voice trembles because it's not aligned with your truth. Noticing the grief that rises when you realize how often you abandoned yourself just to be loved. This noticing is sacred. It's not weakness, it's awakening. And that silenced self, the part of you that was once too much, too loud, too emotional, too real, has never left. She's still here, waiting, for the day you finally choose her. Once we understand how self-abandonment begins, in small, quiet concessions made for love, safety, or acceptance, the next question is inevitable. What does it cost us? Because while the betrayal may be subtle, its consequences are not. They echo across our emotions, our choices, our relationships, even our sense of reality. At first, we don't even realize it's happening. We simply notice that we are tired, not the kind of tired that sleep can fix, but a weariness that settles in the bones. We feel scattered, easily overwhelmed, strangely detached from the life we've built. And beneath the surface, a quiet resentment begins to grow. Not toward others, but toward ourselves. Toward the version of us that keeps saying yes when everything inside us whispers no. This inner dissonance is not a personal flaw. It is the natural result of living in contradiction, of constantly choosing outer peace at the expense of inner truth. Over time, our nervous system becomes the messenger. Anxiety creeps in, not just before big decisions, but in the most ordinary moments. Shame arises without clear reason. Our reactions feel too big or too small, out of sync with what's happening around us. That's not a failure of character. It's the soul protesting its own erasure. As Carl Jung warned, when we repress vital parts of the self, they don't disappear, they turn against us. What we silence becomes somatic. What we deny becomes reactive. And what we fear becomes projected onto others, creating cycles of misunderstanding and disconnection. One of the most painful outcomes of self-abandonment is the loss of inner authority. We no longer trust our own instincts. We ask for second opinions before we've even finished forming a thought. We scan other people's faces for approval before we speak. Our voice becomes cautious, hesitant, not because we lack intelligence or clarity, but because we've been conditioned to believe our truth is negotiable. This erosion doesn't happen overnight. It accumulates in the spaces where we've compromised too often, stayed too long, or remained too quiet. And because the world often rewards our compliance, calling it kindness, maturity, or emotional intelligence, we confuse self-sacrifice with love. But love that demands your silence is not love. And strength that comes at the cost of your voice is not strength. It's survival mode, dressed up as virtue. Eventually, the inner self begins to revolt. Through burnout, through emotional withdrawal, through the quiet longing for a life that feels more real, more yours. But to reclaim that life, we must first tell the truth. That self-abandonment helped us survive, but it cannot help us become whole. The body remembers what the mind has learned to dismiss. And within that remembering is the invitation. To listen, to honor discomfort as data, to follow the quiet ache toward something deeper. Not just relief, but restoration. In the next chapter, we'll explore what that turning point looks like. The moment when choosing yourself finally feels more urgent than being chosen by anyone else. When you begin to understand the cost of abandoning yourself, the anxiety, the resentment, the quiet erosion of your inner voice, something inside you inevitably shifts. Not all at once, and not in any dramatic fashion, but gradually, as if a part of you that has long been silenced begins to stir. What follows is rarely an epiphany. It's more often a sense of quiet unrest. Conversations that used to feel routine suddenly feel uncomfortable. You begin to notice how quickly you say yes, how carefully you word your thoughts, how often you seek permission without realizing it. There's a growing tension between the life you're living and the self who longs to live it. This tension is the beginning of awakening, not in a spiritualized, abstract sense, but in the deeply human experience of realizing that you've lived more for others than for yourself. And with that realization comes a dilemma. What now? Because the idea of choosing yourself may sound empowering, but in practice, it often feels like loss. Loss of roles, of harmony, of the version of you that others depended on. You begin to sense that stepping into authenticity might mean stepping out of relationships, routines, or environments that no longer reflect who you're becoming. It's important to name this fear, not to suppress it, but to understand it. What feels like danger is often just unfamiliar freedom. You're not afraid of being alone. You're afraid of being misunderstood. You're not afraid of setting boundaries. You're afraid of who you'll disappoint in the process. But as Carl Jung reminds us, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and that privilege demands a confrontation with the very systems, identities, and attachments that once kept you safe. Choosing yourself, then, is not a declaration made in defiance. It's a decision forged in stillness, in the spaces where you finally stop performing and begin to listen. Not to the noise around you, but to the quiet voice within. The one that doesn't speak in fear or urgency, but in clarity. The one that says, "This is not who I am anymore." And from that moment forward, your choices begin to shift, not because you force them, but because you can no longer pretend. You may pause before responding to someone's request, not out of hesitation, but out of care for your own capacity. You might walk away from conversations that once drained you, without explanation or guilt. There's a steadiness in you that didn't exist before, not loud or defensive, but firm. You are no longer seeking to prove your worth, only to protect your peace. What makes this moment sacred is not that others notice it, but that you do. You begin to feel the difference between pleasing and choosing, between silence and self-respect. And though the world may not immediately applaud your clarity, your nervous system does. There's less tension, less second-guessing, less collapse into regret after speaking your truth. This is not the final step, but it is the threshold, the place where the false self begins to loosen and the real self starts to return. Not polished, not perfect, but present. And in a world that constantly rewards performance, presence is a quiet revolution. One of the most misunderstood aspects of personal transformation is this. The biggest changes rarely begin on the outside. They start within. And when you choose yourself, not as a concept, but as a daily orientation, your inner world begins to reorganize in quiet but deeply significant ways. You stop leaking energy. That may sound metaphorical, but it's not. According to research in effective neuroscience, particularly the work of Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, our emotional states are metabolically demanding. Every time you suppress a truth, perform agreement, or withhold your voice, your body registers that act as stress. The nervous system responds as if you're under threat, activating stress hormones and shifting your body into a subtle but constant survival mode. Over time, this chronic tension doesn't just wear on your mood, it drains your vitality. But the inverse is also true. When you begin to honor your internal signals, even in small ways, you reclaim energy. Not because life becomes easier, but because you're no longer wasting psychic and physiological resources maintaining a false self. The fatigue begins to lift, not because you're doing less, but because you're no longer betraying yourself in the process of doing. This internal shift brings with it something even more valuable than rest: clarity. You begin to feel what aligns and what doesn't, not as a moral judgment or cognitive choice, but as a somatic truth. Your body starts telling you the difference between effort that drains and effort that nourishes. This clarity becomes the foundation for a new kind of boundary, one that isn't reactionary or rigid, but deeply rooted in self-awareness. Boundaries, at this stage, stop feeling like lines drawn in fear. Instead, they become expressions of care. You are no longer trying to protect yourself from the world. You are honoring the integrity of your own presence within it. The no you used to fear saying becomes a gesture of trust, not against the other, but for yourself. The yes you now offer is no longer diluted by guilt or obligation, but grounded in honest desire. As your relationship with yourself transforms, your external world responds. Relationships that once relied on your self-erasure may begin to shift, not because you demand it, but because you're no longer available to sustain imbalance. Some people will resist this change, not out of malice, but because your clarity disrupts their expectation of who you've been. Others, however, will meet your new self with equal truth, and those are the connections that begin to feel less like transactions and more like resonance. It's here that Carl Jung's concept of individuation becomes not just theory, but lived reality. Individuation is the process of becoming whole, of integrating all the parts of yourself, including those you once exiled. It's not about perfection or detachment. It's about becoming so anchored in your truth that the world no longer defines you. It mirrors you. And from that place, your choices, your time, and your relationships all begin to reorganize around authenticity. You'll notice other shifts, too, subtle at first, but increasingly undeniable. Your relationship with time begins to change. You're no longer driven by urgency or the invisible pressure to prove your worth in every interaction. Instead of rushing from one obligation to the next, you begin to assess your energy and your choices through a different lens, one shaped not by external demands, but by internal rhythm. Decisions are made with more consideration, not because you're hesitant, but because you're finally acting from a place of alignment rather than anxiety. Productivity loses its compulsive edge and becomes purposeful. Silence no longer feels awkward. It becomes necessary, a container for integration. Even your solitude begins to take on a different texture. What once felt like emptiness, or something to be filled, now feels restorative. You no longer associate being alone with abandonment. Instead, solitude becomes a form of reconnect, not a withdrawal from life, but a return to the self you've spent years negotiating away. In those quiet moments, there is no need to perform, explain, or impress. There is just presence. And in that presence, you rediscover the steady pulse of your own truth. These changes don't always announce themselves. They don't arrive with applause or clear turning points, but they accumulate, slowly, organically, and with increasing depth. And perhaps the most profound shift is this. You stop waiting for the world to reflect your worth. You stop hoping someone else will choose the real you, because you already have. Choosing yourself is not about rejecting others or declaring superiority. It's about ending the habit of self-neglect that once felt necessary for survival. It's about offering yourself the same loyalty, presence, and protection you've given so freely to everyone else. And when this becomes your new baseline, the world doesn't need to change for your experience to be transformed. You've stopped outsourcing your power. You've returned to center. And from that place, life begins to reorganize itself around a new truth, one rooted not in performance, but in presence. Once you return to your center, something unexpected happens. the external world no longer feels like your primary compass. There's a quiet confidence that begins to take root, not loud, not aggressive, but steady. And yet, this new clarity requires something more than recognition. It requires maintenance, integration, continuity, because the greatest challenge isn't discovering who you are. It's remaining loyal to that truth in a world that constantly invites you to forget. This is where the real work begins, not in epiphany, but in repetition. In returning to yourself each day with the same tenderness you would offer someone you deeply love. In small, nearly invisible acts that slowly build the architecture of self-trust. Carl Jung called individuation the process of becoming oneself, whole and indivisible. But this process is not abstract. It is not about arriving at a permanent state of clarity. It's about cultivating a relationship with your inner world that is durable, especially when external conditions are unstable. It's about learning how to hold your center in the face of disapproval, ambiguity, loneliness, and uncertainty. And that requires something we don't often associate with psychological healing: rhythm. Choosing yourself becomes a rhythm when you stop looking for breakthrough moments and start honoring daily ones. The moment you wake up and ask your body, "What do I need today?" The moment you notice resentment bubbling beneath a yes, and you choose not to override it. The moment you feel the old pull to perform, to explain, to accommodate, and instead, you pause. You listen. You shift. These are not grand gestures. They are micro-adjustments with macro consequences. Because every time you choose yourself, even quietly, you signal to your unconscious, "I can be trusted." And that signal compounds. For many, this begins in the body, not in the mind's ideas about who you should be, but in the body's truth about how you are. Your body doesn't lie. When a boundary is crossed, it contracts. When your values are honored, it softens. Over time, your nervous system becomes your teacher, not one of fear, but of wisdom, guiding you towards situations that nourish and away from those that deplete. There is also ritual in your inner dialogue. Most of us have inherited voices that question, criticize, or correct our truth before it has even formed. Choosing yourself daily means learning to interrupt those inherited voices with ones you create intentionally. It means shifting from internal interrogation to internal witnessing. From "Why are you like this?" to "I see what you're feeling, and I'm here." These rituals are not loud. They don't announce themselves, but they change everything. Because when you stop betraying yourself in small ways, your outer life begins to reshape itself, not through willpower, but through coherence. You start leaving conversations that subtly erode your energy, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. You become more comfortable with disappointing others if it means remaining in alignment. You no longer make promises that cost your peace. And slowly, the old patterns, the ones built on fear, guilt, or survival, lose their grip. This, too, is loyalty. Not to an image, not to an identity, but to your living, evolving truth. And that kind of loyalty is generative. It feeds you. It protects you. It expands you. And, most importantly, it becomes self-sustaining. Over time, choosing yourself becomes less about decision and more about orientation. Less about what you say or do, and more about what you no longer tolerate. It becomes your default setting, not your exception. A quiet compass that helps you navigate relationships, opportunities, even silence, with a clarity that feels less like effort and more like remembering. This is where individuation becomes embodiment. Not a theory you admire, but a life you inhabit. Not a trait to develop, but a practice to protect. And when that practice is rooted in reverence, not just for who you are now, but for who you're still becoming, everything around you begins to shift in response. Not because you're trying to change the world, but because, finally, You're no longer abandoning yourself to survive it. If this message found you at a time when you're learning to return to yourself, even quietly, even slowly, let it be a reminder you're not alone in this work. Because the day you finally choose yourself, fully, honestly, without apology, everything around you begins to shift. Not because the world changes, but because you do. Here at Hidden Mind, we explore the inner landscape through the lens of Jungian psychology, emotional resilience, and soul-aligned healing. If this resonated with you, I invite you to support this space by subscribing, liking this video, and sharing your reflections in the comments below. Your voice matters here, not because it's perfect, but because it's real. And sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is speak from where we are, not from where we think we should be.